How is it that bud cars could see commuter service in the 21st century in Vermont? Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to find out how that might happen. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 109 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we're talking to Christopher Parker. He is the executive director for Vermont Rail Action Network, which is a rail advocacy group advocating for both passenger and freight. We talk with him about why rail advocacy is important, especially in the case of Vermont, but looking at how the lessons learned in Vermont can be taken elsewhere, as well as something called AllEarth Rail, which is a commuter startup that is looking to take bud cars and put them into service in the state of Vermont. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank those of you who are supporting the Roundhouse on Patreon. It means a lot to have your financial support. If you listen to the podcast regularly and you believe in what we're doing here, patreon.com/the Roundhouse. At $5 a month, you get early access to episodes. New episodes of the Roundhouse launch on the third Tuesday of the month. So if you're a $5 or more subscriber on Patreon, that means you get an episode on the second Tuesday of the month. Patreon.com/the Roundhouse. Thank you as always for your support. Our guest today is the executive director for Vermont Rail Action Network. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Christopher Parker.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's great to have you on the show. We're going to be talking about Vermont and its relationship to passenger rail, but also how what you're experiencing at the state level can apply to other states and even sort of the national picture of things. But a good place to start is, what is the Vermont Rail Action Network?
So we're an advocacy group. We advocate for better train service, both freight and passenger.
How did this organization initially form?
So there has been rail advocacy in Vermont since 1972. That's when the Vermont Association of Rail Passengers formed. They were responsible for getting the Montrealer. They folded into Train Riders Northeast. And in 2006, NARP, the National Association of Railroad Passengers, put out the call for route volunteers, which was something that appealed to me. And so I stepped up and they sent me off to Wayne Davis, who was running Train Riders Northeast. And then in 2007, there was a group called the Vermont Rail Advocacy Network, which had formed from a union of the commuters that had formerly ridden the Champlain Flyer, the commuter train up in Burlington, and another group called One Voice for Rail, a freight advocacy group from Rutland. So we folded it all into the big tent in 2007, and it became Vermont Rail Action Network. And I was executive director from that point. And I took some years off recently to focus on family, but now I'm back.
What are the similarities and differences for advocating for passenger rail versus advocating for freight rail?
The beautiful thing is you get a coalition in the same room from very different sides. This is Vermont, you remember. So you have the hippies on one side, and you have the, the environmentalists with them, and you have the shippers and the business people and so forth on the other side, and they're all on the same team. And that's what you want, is a large coalition on the same team moving in the same direction. So it's one rail network, and in Vermont, we're not talking about capacity issues. We're talking about a need to upgrade the network. So passenger brings the public support, freight pays the bills.
For those who aren't as familiar with the current lay of the land as far as the infrastructure in Vermont, perhaps you can provide us a brief overview.
Yeah, sure. So we have two regional railroads that operate most of the track in Vermont. So the Vermonter, the Amtrak train, rides the rails of the New England Central Railroad, and it follows what is Interstate 91 and then Interstate 89. So it goes up the Connecticut River Valley to White River Junction, and then heads up to Burlington, and then the rails go up to Canada, heading towards Montreal. So that's the New England Central Railroad. It's owned by Genesee and Wyoming, lots of orange. And then the other railroad is the Vermont Rail System, headquartered in Burlington. And it operates mostly on state-owned track. So the Ethan Allen is the train that comes up the Hudson from New York City, the Amtrak train, and it ends up in Rutland, Vermont, and will soon be heading up to Burlington over the tracks of the Vermont Rail System. I can say also just we have a little bit of 79-mile-an-hour track, but mostly we're talking 59-mile-an-hour passenger running, 40 or 25 for freight. So most of the lines have either one freight a day or a through freight and a local freight, and that's about the size of it.
The Ethan Allen is a train that I'm familiar with. I have family that lives in Rutland, and so I've used that on a couple of occasions to get to them from either New York City or from Albany. It's been a long time coming because I've had conversations with them about getting the train from Rutland to Burlington, and this conversation's been going on for years. So what are the challenges that have faced that expansion?
Well, the expansion actually came about because in 2009, there was a plan to eliminate that train. And we, of course, had a different vision. And Rutland, the region of Rutland, the city, the leadership, everyone had a different vision. And the train was not discontinued. And we said at that time, this train is not fulfilling its logical purpose by ending in Rutland. It really ought to turn north and head to the largest city in Vermont. And I think that was somewhat self-evident. But in order to do that, we had to take the track, which was a little bit of 40-mile-an-hour freight and a lot of 25 and some 10, we had to take that track and upgrade it so that it would be competitive. And in order to find the money to do so, what Vermont did is go to the Tiger program, which is one of the US DOT grant funding programs that started from Barack Obama's time. And we went back to that well 3 or 4 times, 10 million at a time, in order to install welded rail and get the track to a level that it could support the train. There was also, I guess, a political dimension of that. I'm remembering a particular meeting in Rutland, and the Secretary of Transportation came and started the meeting by talking about the Vermonter on the other side of the state. And, there's a lot of states that have this little natural tension between one side of the state and the other. And it's always one of those things that if you don't know that tension, you can end up putting your foot in it. So anyway, the Secretary of Transportation shows up, starts talking about the other side of the state, but he's good. He takes a reading of the meeting. And of course, we had stocked that meeting with our people and our agenda. And by the end of that meeting, the state's vision was not to apply for 1 grant for the other side of the state, but 2 grants, including that side of the state. And from that meeting forward, there was not a political doubt that that train was a priority of the state.
It's good to have a base of supporters. How has VRAN developed its base over the years and motivated people into different forms of advocacy? And what are those forms of advocacy that you encourage Vermonters to participate in?
We have a list that is now about 6,000 names, which is pretty significant. And it's not only 6,000 random names, it's people who obviously have real deep and passionate support for the train, but also people who are the leaders in the community. So we've always made an effort to simultaneously send our communications out to our base, as I say, in the world of politics, but also to the right people, for lack of a better word, the people who already have influence. So, for example, our board of directors includes the state legislator, it includes a mayor, it includes somebody who's vice president at the largest real estate firm in the state, at least on the commercial side. And so, thinking about that time in Rutland where their train was threatened, the core of our work there was working with the Chamber of Commerce and the regional planning organization, the mayor and the alderman. There was a fellow who stepped up and really put his heart and effort into it, and he ended up running for state legislator largely on the backs of that work that he did for that train. And the other thing, just a practical thing we did, we put out a petition at that time to save the train. We got 1,000 names, and those names, became more names for our organization to include.
How is VRAN supported financially?
So we fundraise. So we get contributions from people who value the train or value what the train does for their business. So our members include riders. Some of those riders are like the rail fan types. Some of them use the train for like critical purposes, like medical appointments. Then there are people, for example, I'm thinking of a hotel owner, for example, across the street from the railroad station. He has an obvious financial stake in the train. So there are people like that. They're shippers. The railroads themselves have given us support. And the other thing is, honestly, I have made sacrifices and been willing to work for a lot less money than I would otherwise be making. And I have also done consulting work on the side in order to pay the bills. So hire me.
What is the work that you find yourself involved with on a day-to-day basis?
About a third of the work is working directly with the Agency of Transportation and legislators and the railroads, and kind of sharing our technical expertise. About a third of the work is communications. So communicating with our supporters, communicating with the media, communicating with business and community leaders, the railroads, and so forth, planners. And about a third of the work is the back office functions. So the mailing list and all the other things that a nonprofit organization needs to run.
Other than the success of getting the Ethan Allen to remain a service in the state, as well as extending it to Burlington in the long run, what are some other successes that your organization has seen in recent history?
So our passenger rail map is expanding. So the Ethan Allen's going to Burlington. The Vermonter will be extended to Montreal. And the physical rail structure is improving. So what had been 10 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour is now 40, 59 in more places. And most of the rails of the state are 286. That is the weight limit. It's the national standard of 286,000 pounds. And we have a robust rail plan for the future. And during the time from 2007 to now, state rail investment has increased by 50%. And I'm pretty confident that our attention to the cause has resulted in a budgetary impact.
How are the struggles that you've encountered different and similar when we look at the national conversation about Amtrak and promoting passenger rail?
I think they're pretty similar. So, our work is to form alliances with other people and other organizations and magnify the support. What did Arlo Guthrie say about when one person walks in and sings Alice's Restaurant? They're crazy, and when two people walk in, I forget. But when you have a whole bunch of people, that's where you have your power. So that's what we do. And the work that we do of communicating, it's the same work that goes on a national level. And the work of supporting your friends in Congress or in the State House, pretty similar stuff. I think the challenge of capacity and class one, different landscape. We have much more local and regional railroad focused approach, and we have pretty tight relationships with our railroads, and that served us very well. And we've been able to do that because we know them. So that on the national level, I think timekeeping and the relationship with freight railroads is a nut that really needs to be cracked.
Because you have a good relationship with your local railroads, what factors do you think have contributed to that, to where they see passenger rail as something worth supporting on their network?
There's a couple different things. I think, their willingness and interest in being community spirited counts for a lot. They're locally based, and they understand that the passenger train is a contribution to their community. And it's generally true that when a company has a headquarters, they often contribute to that headquarters area. I think that, just the relationships of knowing these people. I knew them before I became executive director. So for them, what they're getting a practical gain, which is increased community and political support translates to dollars for infrastructure. And both of those regional railroads have benefited a lot. We're talking tens of millions, high tens of millions for some of them. So there is a real financial gain that they get from our work, which is great. The public supports increased infrastructure investment, and they're getting it. And the other thing that's interesting is each of these railroads has a contract with Amtrak, which is not part of the legacy contracts that Amtrak inherited in 1971. Each of these railroads is paid more per train mile than the other class one railroads. And so for them, the trains are a bigger contributor to the bottom line operations-wise, not just infrastructure. It's worth it for them to do their part to deliver a good service for Amtrak. And just personally, I happen to know that the people on each of these railroads are personally supportive of rail service, where it can work financially for them.
All of us, or at least most of us listening to this podcast, are in favor of passenger rail and that advocacy in general. What are some benefits of it that are unique to Vermont in terms of how the geography of the state is, and when more of these visions are realized, what are specific benefits to the state?
I don't know if it's unique to Vermont, but Vermont has an economy that is somewhat in orbit of the larger financial centers like New York and Boston. So the farmers in Vermont send their produce to the bigger places. The manufacturing is somewhat of a satellite to the larger places. And so the train provides a link to the larger economies that brings economic benefits to Vermont. So specifically, that is people who come to Vermont, tourists and so forth. And of course, 55% of the people in New York City don't have cars. So if you want their tourist dollars, you'll have a train. It encourages people to move to Vermont because the train gives a link back to the family, back to their clients, back to their grandkids. And even though those trips may be, somewhat infrequent, or at least not every day, the fact that you can make a trip by a train is the kind of thing you keep in mind when you decide to move somewhere. And even the hospital in Rutland used that fact that the Ethan Allen ran to Rutland, and they used that fact, present tense, in their marketing, their recruitment of doctors. Apparently, it turns out that doctors need to feel linked to their spouse's family location or they won't take a job. So people move higher and build based on the fact that they can take a train.
Other than getting the Ethan Allen service extended to Burlington, what are some of the other long-term goals that you have?
Well, I'm going to throw out a couple of things we haven't talked about yet. Obviously, Burlington, obviously going to Montreal. Another thing is we have concerns about some of the service quality that the Amtrak train represents, particularly food service. Vermont is a very foodie state, and Vermont is proud of the food that it produces. We would like to see local food on a train labeled the Vermonter. There are a number of issues with that. The train runs right through to Washington, D.C., and the Ethan Allen through to New York. There are complications. That's not an easy goal. So we're throwing it out there as a goal and figuring out how to solve it as we go. Another thing that I think you know about is the AllEarth rail idea of bud cars providing a local commuter type service up in Vermont. We call it community rail.
Let's talk more about AllEarth Rail. This serves as a good transition point to that. That was my first exposure to your group, but also specifically to some of the plights for increasing passenger rail opportunities in the state. What led to the creation of AllEarth Rail, and what is AllEarth Rail?
There's been talk about commuter trains in the area around Burlington, the several counties that surround Burlington, for a number of years. Gene Skarapowski, in fact, did a study about that 30 years ago or more at this point. I'm forgetting the exact date. Commuter rail has many benefits and advantages, but does well in dense places, which of course Vermont is not. And so solving that question is what led to the bud cars coming into the picture. What we were reacting to was a series of studies that kind of posited a Metro North type style, heavy infrastructure and large cost structure into the environment of Vermont, and finding that the ridership and economics wouldn't work. To which our response is, well, you don't have to run a Metro North in order to provide a valuable service. And if you look at a place like, say, Switzerland or rural Europe and practically anywhere, it's on a much more sustainable scale. So, bud cars have been around for a while and they are a solid option. And it turns out that there was a fleet that had been re-engined and completely rebuilt for service in Texas, and also another fleet up in Moncton, New Brunswick that was available. And so David Blittersdorf, who happens to be one of our big supporters, said, what if I buy them? And now that's a different approach than ordinarily taken, but it's brilliant because, in fact, there's a long history of startups that use used equipment. And, we're really talking the short line model here, right? Lower cost, used equipment, but quite serviceable, and a sort of, I guess you would say, a low cost mindset. So an RDC aside from not needing a locomotive, which is the obvious part, it doesn't need a full-sized high-level platform at a station. It doesn't need the same servicing. Doesn't obviously need as much fuel. It's just a lighter on the environment product. So it's got all those advantages, but then there's one more. So David is his business is solar trackers and wind power. He's an engineer. He's a fiddler, and he realized that you could take the diesel engine out of one of these units, and the same space would accommodate an electric engine from like a electric car and 3 battery units, and it would produce the same horsepower, which is really interesting. Imagine that the horsepower of an SUV can move a whole bud car. But that's the advantage of rail right there, dramatized.
For those who aren't familiar with the Bud car, it is a rail diesel car, or RDC, that was built by the Bud company way back in the 50s. But they have had incredible lives to them in terms of their ability to remain in commuter service via rail. The national rail provider for Canada still has a number of them in service. Their longevity is quite tremendous. And when I posed the call for questions for this episode to Facebook, I saw that David himself was responding to a number of them directly, which was really cool to see. Somebody was asking about if they would get repowered, and he was talking a little bit about exploring Tesla technology for doing that electric repowering that you were mentioning.
The initial plan is take out one of the engines and electrify it. That's a sort of a safety margin there. So it makes it a hybrid.
A hybrid RDC. That's sounding really interesting as a concept to explore. How does one navigate around the fact that as historic equipment, it wasn't designed for ADA access? Is that a matter of having the platform infrastructure in place, or are there other ways to work around that?
Well, it is not impossible to use them if you have a wheelchair. It just doesn't meet the full level of standards that have, since been designed. So yeah, we would need a high-level platform. Now, I don't think we're thinking about, the Amtrak model of full concrete down to the frost line, $1 million arrangement. I think we're thinking something easy and much cheaper. And of course, it doesn't have to be a full train length either for 2 cars. So yes, high level. And these are short trips, so bathroom requirements are different than for an Amtrak train.
Peter Burmeister asks, what will it take to get these into service? That rail line has nothing running on it 99% of the day and night. I'm assuming that he's referring to the lines around Montpelier and the like, as opposed to those that have Amtrak service already.
Well, no, he's right. There is plenty of capacity on those lines. So there's a couple things. We have already run these cars. So, from a technical point of view, we could strike a deal with the railroads and off we go. And in fact, we have done that just for some one-off trips. But in order to, and there are stations already existing because Amtrak trains already run in the area. So that does give us a head start because the tracks are already in good shape most of the way around Burlington. 7 miles between Burlington and Essex Junction are not, so that would need to be upgraded. So one can get an exemption from PTC up to a certain level of service. One can also get an exemption from PTC if there is temporal separation, which is a fancy way of saying freight trains run at night and the passenger trains run at the day. Or one can install PTC, either the expensive version that the most Class 1 railroads are using, or possibly sort of a lighter version. So over a certain level of frequency, and PTC is going to be the largest challenge, at least in terms of dollars. I would say the largest challenge in terms of, not sure how to put it, but the most difficult in ways that don't involve money will be an agreement with the Genesee Wyoming Railroad and the New England Central for track access.
Some people may be curious about the Champlain Flyer service that was offered back in the mid 2000s. And it was a previous commuter train operation that ultimately shut down due to lack of ridership. How do you think the market has changed since then to allow for new opportunity with these initiatives?
The first thing to note is that the train didn't have lack of ridership. It only had the problem of not meeting expectations. So the ridership estimate was predicated on a highway that ran parallel to the train being under construction. But as things happen, the highway proposal was delayed, didn't happen. And so the ridership levels were lower and provided a way for doubters to say, this is a failure. But it wasn't a failure for the people who rode the train. And in rush hour, about 100 people per train were riding. So they found the train useful. Since that time, about 1,000 new jobs have been created just south of Union Station in Burlington. The old Blodgett Pizza Factory became the Hula Enterprise Accelerator, and the old GE factory became the Vermont Innovation Center, and Dealer.com moved into to the old brush factory. All of these were freight customers, but now they are commuter train job creators. And the other thing about that commuter train was that it did not go to Essex Junction, where the state's largest employer, at IBM at the time, now Global Foundries, is located. And that's the vision of our network, is to serve them as well.
Does your group have a target date for when you would like to see these agreements be worked out and to start offering this service on a regular basis?
No, we're not at that point right now. It's unpredictable. And, it would be, I don't know, we would want to be in a deeper partnership with the freight railroads to have agreements, and we're not there at the moment, and so I wouldn't want to speak for them either.
I'm going to ask for some numbers, and if you don't have them off the top of your head, that's totally okay, but I am curious, what are the route miles in the state that are currently passenger serviced? And with the vision of AllEarth Rail, how many more route miles would that add?
So off the top of my head, I can't tell you the mileage in the state. I just don't know. But I can tell you that the full vision would add only 14 miles for the maximum build. The AllEarth Rail network, at its full extent, and we have sort of, plan A and plan B, smaller version sort of ways of thinking about it. But the fullest extent is around 70, if I'm remembering right. But there again, I don't have the number right in my head at the moment. So the largest amount of miles are already passenger only. We're just talking a small link here and another small link there.
Patrick Webb asks, what other equipment does AllEarth Rail hope to use in the future? For example, buying ex-Amfleet coaches, perhaps?
That vision of running electrified community scale trains is too good to just pass up. So obviously you can, whatever equipment's available at the time you need it can be obtained, but that's a pretty compelling vision to electrify on a scale that's actually possible. It's hard to imagine stringing overhead wire on a line that has one passenger train a day, plus our operation. But this is actually doable. Apart from that, we've had conversations like, what if we got dining cars and ran our own dining service? Maybe hired the Amtrak people, but used Vermont service. I mean Vermont food. That's not a plan. That's just sort of an idle conversation. But you asked. What if we bought our own baggage cars, set them up as private cars, and hauled Vermont farmers' produce down to New York City? Again, that's several steps short of any kind of plan. It's just sort of a thought.
When I first started traveling to Rutland, one of the things I found in my rail research was at the time, and we're looking back about 6 years or so, there was a private car owner who had an ex-Santa Fe diner. And on specific weekends, he would, or I don't know if it was weekends specifically, but specific dates, he would attach it to the back of the Ethan Allen. And it was sort of a round trip service where you could leave Rutland and you'd ride on this diner and you'd have your specialty meal. And then you'd get off, I think at Saratoga Springs, and then meet the north. I mean, you could ride it all the way to New York City, but if you just wanted the diner experience, you could get off, I think it was at Saratoga Springs, and then take the train back north to Rutland. That seemed like a great way to be able to incorporate local cuisine in a way that's sort of involving Amtrak, in that it's at least connected to their service. I don't know if he's still doing that or not. You might have a better sense, but I'm wondering too if the private rail car owner scene might provide some answers to that.
We're certainly aware of the private rail car scene, and know some of them, including the fellow you're talking about. I haven't talked to him since before COVID, so I'm not sure where things stand there. It certainly provides intriguing options.
One of the things I remember hearing from a private rail car owner was how nice it was to have railroads like Vermont Railway be very open to providing excursions for passengers, especially on some of their lines that aren't currently serviced by passenger rail, such as currently Rutland to Burlington, but also Rutland towards Bellows Falls on their network.
That's right. Well, Vermont rail system, they're always up for making a buck somehow, and I say that in the best sense, because they go out and chase freight traffic in a way that many railroads don't. And they are also open to earning an income from passenger traffic. They are what a short line should be in the best way.
In part because they are doing their own regular excursions, which I think has to help them when it comes to their community relation building, because they're offering these trips or these experiences. Heck, I think even through COVID, they had like a whistle stop tour where they parked the train and people could see it. And that type of relationship building is so powerful.
It is. And they're practical things, like they have people who understand, just for example, the difference between freight train braking and passenger train braking, on a level like that. New England Central does too. The insurance, maybe, not sure about that, but I think it just makes it easier.
The challenge, as we've explored a little bit today, when it comes to passenger rail, is that I think for a lot of us, we look at headlines in the news to our area about Amtrak is exploring this, there's resistance from a freight railroad, there's governmental resistance. It feels very weighty. It feels very heavy. It has that feeling of, but what can I as an individual possibly do to impact this conversation when there's so many forces beyond my control? So Christopher, I pose the question to you. When you're talking to Vermonters, how do you encourage them to get involved, and what power can an individual have in that conversation?
What an individual can do is rally the support for passenger rail among allies, among a large network of supporters, particularly supporters that already have clout in some way. That's the most valuable thing. Some other things that you mentioned suggest a certain level of patience, right? These projects can be a decade to gather support and gather funding sources and go forward. So it's helpful just to know that landscape and not get discouraged, and help other people not get discouraged. Understand that it just takes that long for things. When I was starting out, the first thing I did was just show up. So I would go to meetings, I would talk to people, I would ask questions, I would learn. The biggest thing I did was just to meet the players. So I think showing up is really the first step.
What do you find most rewarding at the end of the day about the work that you are accomplishing with your supporters and your partners?
I'm interested in railroad economics and the way that operations can be improved. So, I'm satisfied that the Amtrak train is going to go to Burlington because it's going to increase service for people. But really, what excites me most is that the economic performance of that train is going to be better, because according to at least one estimate, ridership should go up 50% because there's more people in Burlington. So that train's going to run an hour and 40 minutes longer, but the level of revenue it's going to get from that little trip should be, all things equal, should be significantly more than the extra cost. I just think that's really cool. It's got a logic to it that I like. And the same thing on the Vermonter side. It's only an hour from St. Albans up to Montreal, but there's 5 million people in Montreal. And right now what happens is that train starts out from small St. Albans with just a few people on, and at every stop it adds more people until it gets to New York City as a sold-out train. But up north, it's pretty empty. But if you start out from Montreal, it's like a mall with an anchor store at each end. It's going to start out full, and all those Quebecois folks are going to come down, get off in Montreal, go do their tourist things, while Vermonters get on the same seat. So you're only running an hour, but you have vastly increased the load factor, the amount of seats that are full, and you significantly increase the train far more than the operating costs. So again, I think that's cool, and I think that there is a real value for advocates from any, wherever you are, to bring that knowledge into the conversation that's happening at a political and leadership level, because they don't know that, and it's not reasonable to expect them to know that. Most people are not train experts, but you are as an advocate, and that's your place in that conversation, is to bring that in. And they like learning things that are going to directly benefit their community. So there's a lot of things that can be done better in the passenger train world, and I like thinking about that.
It's always good to envision that brighter future and what that may hold for everybody. The vision that you're laying out for your organization and for what you hope to see done on the Amtrak side of things, AllEarth Rail, going to be very nifty to see how this continues to evolve over the coming years. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast to talk about what is going on. You can check out their website, railvermont.org, and get a sense of what their history is, what they've been involved with, how you can get involved, especially if you're a Vermonter, get some ideas for what you might be involved with on your own local level if you live somewhere else in the United States. Christopher, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And feel free to reach out if you want. I'm at christopher@railvermont.org.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were at the press conference announcing the launch of a fundraising and restoration campaign for Pennsylvania Railroad K4S Pacific number 1361. That episode didn't have a question of the day, so we're going to go back to the episode before that, which was talking with Nick Turinetti and Rob Taburn of the Wisconsin Great Northern about the Mark Twain Zephyr. And I asked you guys what your favorite streamliner is, which elicited a load of responses. First, from YouTube, Patrick Webb writes, I love the Hiawatha Streamliners, the 20th Century Limited, and also the trains of the London Northeastern Railway, such as the Silver Jubilee. On Facebook, Frank Bailey writes, to me, the best train of all was the California Zephyr pre-Amtrak. It had the best equipment, although the Empire Builder and North Coast Limited were very close seconds. I so miss that era. Brian J. Smith writes, the post-war 20th Century Limited. Who wouldn't enjoy a lobster meal with a glass of scotch, speeding along the Hudson at sunset while having a chance encounter in the diner with a celebrity or head of state? That's a good argument right there, Brian. And Russell Swinnerton writes, the North Shore Electroliner, or Liberty Liner. That's a good choice, Russell, and one that both examples survive, one at the Illinois Railway Museum, and the other at the Rock Hill Trolley Museum, across from a favorite at the Roundhouse, the East Broadtop Railroad. Streamliners are phenomenal. I have to say my personal favorite is the 1955 Canadian Pacific Railway's the Canadian. But I am also partial to the California Zephyr. Your question of the day for this episode is, what commuter rail service has impressed you the most? Let us know on the roundhousepodcast.com, links to social media there. It's always fun to have you guys along for the ride, whether we're talking streamliners, commuter rail, or whatever else we have coming down the tracks. Thank you as always for listening, and remember that the Roundhouse is our house.